there, so I'm Tiffany West, the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz. Our climate action program is in its 10th year this year, so we are very excited about that. I spend about half my time on emissions reduction and the other half of my time on climate adaptation strategy. And just to kind of share with you what I'm going to be talking about over these next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what our coastal hazards look like, what they are, our city's adaptation work to date, what specifically we have asset-wise, ecosystem-wise, tourism-wise, what assets are vulnerable to coastal climate change, what adaptation strategies we're considering, and I think most excitedly, I'm most excited to share with you what's ahead. We have two major grant-funded projects that are starting next month that I'm going to share a little bit with you about, and how you can also get involved in those projects. I think it is important for us to distinguish the difference between climate action and climate adaptation at the outset. Some people don't really know, what do you mean by climate adaptation? What we're talking about here are the actions, the policies, the programs that we develop to deal with climate change impacts. So as opposed to emissions reduction, where we're really trying to slow or stop the impacts of climate change. So just wanted to kind of clarify that terminology to start with. In terms of the coastal impacts in Santa Cruz that we are subject to, it's probably pretty obvious that related to sea level rise, we're looking at increased rates of erosion, rising tides, and increased frequency and intensity of coastal storms. We also are subject to increased acidification, ocean acidification, which of course could impact our ecosystems, habitat, and livelihoods of our fishermen and fisherwomen. We are also concerned about saltwater intrusion and the increased potential of that in Santa Cruz. Right now, in terms of saltwater intrusion, we do not have any wells that are facing saltwater intrusion at this moment, unlike our neighbors at Soquel Creek Water District, who have many of their groundwater wells that are saltwater intruded. In Santa Cruz, only 5% of our water comes from groundwater, so most of it comes from the San Lorenzo River, 95% of it. So I'm really going to be focusing in this talk on the impacts related to sea level rise. Although I have to say, on ocean acidification, as I'm going to share with you, we just adopted last year our climate adaptation plan update and really expanded our ocean acidification section through a partnership with NOAA. And so that's an area that we don't talk about so much, but we really are starting to better understand our proximate impacts in terms of ocean acidification. So in terms of adaptation work that the city has done to date, we first started working on adaptation back in about 2010, 2011, when Gary Griggs, who I think is probably a really familiar name to those of you in the room here, he is Professor Emeritus at UCSC, Coastal Geomorphology. He completed our first vulnerability assessment. He and actually Professor Brent Haddad, who's in Environmental Studies Department, and was actually my doctoral advisor. They first conducted a vulnerability assessment that really was the first time the city began to look at risks and vulnerabilities. It was still considered the early stage of science in terms of sea level rise, but it really enabled the city to start to think about coastal adaptation and what we're facing. That became part of the city's first climate adaptation plan, which was also one of the first in the state, again, adopted in 2012. That was developed alongside what's called a local hazard mitigation plan. That's that LHMP. And the local hazard mitigation plan looks at all hazards in the city, not just climate influence hazards, so including earthquake, tsunami, those kinds of things. The LHMP is really critical for us because if we can get our local hazard mitigation plan approved by California Office of Emergency Services and FEMA, that makes us eligible for both pre and post disaster mitigation funding, which allows us to fund some of these strategies that I'm gonna be talking about. So we were able to do that for the first time in 2012, and then again just recently this past year. Fast forward 5 years, we begin to start thinking about how to institutionalize adaptation planning and policy into city operations and policy and so forth. But we really, in the past 2.5 years, have been very highly focused on adaptation. We completed our first sea level rise specific vulnerability assessment, which I'm going to share with you some of our maps, in 2017, and uniquely a social vulnerability to climate change assessment, which also is one of the first in the state. Let me show you some things that we came out of this. So what you're looking at here, this is our sea level rise vulnerability assessment looked at those 3 hazards I mentioned from the outset: rising tide, coastal storm, flooding, and erosion. These next 2 maps show you what we're expecting, what we're projecting based on best available science in terms of those combined hazards. We also have in our map, in our adaptation plan, the hazards separated. So you can see, if you want to see what just rising tide looks like, you can see that. But for simplicity, we have them combined here. So what you're looking at here is these blue zones that run inland are those combined hazards. What are the colors? The darker the color is the closer to the baseline year, which for us is 2010. And the farther we get out towards 2100 is the lighter color. What do we see here? Well, really, there's no big surprises here, right? We have we have flooding down in the beach flats area, some more flooding up in Arana Gulch through the harbor area, increased erosion along West Cliff, including some flooding down at Bethany Curve, which is in the middle of West Cliff right there, that blue little spike that kind of jags out. And then back at Natural Bridges, more erosion and flooding. Not a lot of big surprises in terms of what's coming, because it's really all based on elevation and depth of sea level rise. The question is when. So when we did this assessment, the recommendations from the state were to tier to 3 different time horizons: 2030, 2060, and 2100. That has since changed since we completed our sea level rise assessment, and instead they would like jurisdictions to look at the probabilistic, so the probability of certain storms happening and different depths of sea level rise happening. In fact, one of the scenarios that the state wants you to evaluate is, what does 10 feet of sea level rise look like for your jurisdiction? Since we had already completed our sea level rise vulnerability assessment, we really didn't have the funds to go back, reanalyze, and in fact, until recently, there were no maps available with these kind of layers for that 10 feet of sea level rise. But what I always say to folks is, what that means is, if we really are on a trajectory, and the trajectory is largely based on what our emissions output is. So if we continue on business as usual, we probably will get to the 10 feet of sea level rise. If we can pull back, try to get to the Paris Agreement in terms of emissions reduction, maybe we'll stay more around 5 feet, 2.4 feet. But what I always say is, what we know about 10 feet of sea level rise, even though we don't have it mapped here, that means that these impacts come sooner, right? And so that, to me, is a huge motivation to plan right now for this. So a couple caveats here. This is assuming that all of our protective structures hold. So we've got coastal armoring, which would be seawalls and riprap. We also have pumps down in the beach flats area that when it floods now, we pump out. And then, of course, we have the levee system. One other caveat in this is that you can see we're not seeing any river flooding here. And that is because the modeling only looks at coastal flooding. I'm working right now on a project, scoping a project to get funding to do the mapping of the river also. So now we're actually even underestimating flooding because we're not including that riverine flooding component. So this is what it looks like if those protective structures fail. So if the seawalls fail, if the pumps fail, and what do we see? Well, we see much more flooding and then you see a lot more blue, right? In the near lagoon area, down in the downtown area. And of course, you can see on your right-hand side here, all of the critical city facilities, where they're located. Number 5, the police station. Of course, our wastewater treatment facility, $100+ million award-winning facility that serves our region from Capitola, some of Scotts Valley, and Live Oak and unincorporated areas of Santa Cruz County, in addition to the city. Very important asset. So again, more motivation for us to deal with this. But let me show you some other things that are impacted by this. We have, I think it's 31 coastal public access points, stairwells, steps down to the beach and so forth. And I should mention the black and white lines here, that is our coastal armoring. So again, riprap, which are the big boulders, or the seawalls. Those are shown by the black and white. And coastal access, of course, Santa Cruz recreation, coastal recreation, ocean recreation is ubiquitous here. I mean, that's part of our identity and culture. So we need to be concerned about how erosion, rising tide, coastal storms can potentially affect our access points. Similarly, we have a number of surf breaks, as you'll see down here. We have done a study of really right now the breaks that are along West Cliff between the wharf and Lighthouse Point, and have found, I did a trade with this guy who's the surf professor at CSU Channel Islands. I sit on his surfer oral history board, and in exchange he did a break by break analysis of when we expect our surf breaks to drown due to sea level rise. And unfortunately, we're projecting between 2040 and 2060, these surf breaks are gonna be drowned out in Santa Cruz. Now, what can you do about that? There are some solutions in Australia. They use sand pumps, but where are you gonna get that sand? And if you're taking sand from somewhere else, what does that do to ecosystems and so forth? So in a project that we're working on, I'll kind of talk about how we're gonna look at this, but again, surfing, part of our city's identity. And, going back to, well, I guess I don't even have to go back. Another thing is that we're projecting that the beaches will be lost somewhere between 2060 and 2100 if we don't allow them to move back. So that's a problem with the seawall, right? Seawalls do a really good job of protecting what's behind it, but it doesn't allow the beach to migrate back. And so that means we will lose beaches if we continue to use seawalls. That may be appropriate in some areas, but it may not be appropriate in other areas. We do have the benefit, however, in Santa Cruz of the Harbor Jetty wall right here. There is what's called a littoral drift. It's a sand drift that happens in this direction. So what's fortunate for us is that this jetty actually catches some of that sand. That's why Seabright Beach is actually 3 times the size it was 50 years ago before this jetty was built. That also helps Main Beach. And that is another solution that we're potentially going to be looking at is there a potential for what's called a groin right at the river mouth to counteract the sea level rise that's happening by catching more sand. So that's something that we're thinking about here. Also, another vulnerability is habitat. This is, I know, kind of a crazy, messy map, but what you see on the right-hand side are all the different sensitive ecosystems in Santa Cruz, and they're mapped here. And you can see that some of our hazard zones overlap with those habitats. So what are we gonna do about habitat shifts and cascading effects on species? That's something that we're looking at as well. And then last, what's the social impact of this on our citizens, on our residents, particularly those most vulnerable? So what we did here, we built a social vulnerability score by census block group. It's basically on a neighborhood level. It's based on incidents of poverty, English not spoken well as a first language, disability, age, and crime. Localized crime and the rest of the data comes from the census. So we build a score by neighborhood, and then we rank them relative to one another. What you see here, the red, are the most vulnerable, socially vulnerable folks based on that score, and the green are the least vulnerable. So what do we see? No big surprise, right? We have poverty, we have English not spoken as a first language down in the Beach Flats area, so that's red. Surprisingly, the red that's up extending ocean into the broader Seabright area is driven largely by incidents of elderly folks. So how do we use this information? And I'm kind of just focused on the coast. Over here in this orange area, that's medium social vulnerability, and that's driven by a lot of elderly folks. Also, there are some senior mobile homes that are over in that area that's probably driving that score. How can we use this information? We just started to scratch the surface of this analysis, but I'll give you two examples. Down in the Beach Flats area where we know it floods often, and we have a pretty good idea of when that's going to happen, we could potentially send out reverse 911 calls in Spanish in addition to English. We also need to make sure that anything that goes out with respect to flood or flood insurance needs to be in Spanish, right? I mean, that's very simple. Similarly, over down in the orange area that I'm pointing to down here with elderly folks, you know, what could we do there? Well, one thing we could do is to perhaps consider in our routing, in fact, this is, I think, already considered in the routing of emergency services. They need to get to those folks first because they have mobility issues, right? If there's something that's happening over there, they need to get out of there first before other folks that are able to, you know, get out to their car quickly and get out of there. That's something that the fire department's already got worked out, right? They know where all the old folks' homes are and stuff. So those are just a couple of examples, and we did this analysis with, I got so fortunate. I got connected up with Dr. Giuliano Khalil, who he got his PhD with Gary Griggs up at UC Santa Cruz. I connected with him through the American Geophysicists Union's Thriving Earth Exchange. He did this whole analysis for free for me, and it has been, we've probably given 20 talks over the past year about this kind of work and how we can take it further. So we're starting to talk about how can we take that further, and social vulnerability will be a very big focus in the two major projects that we have coming up starting soon, and I'll share more with you about that soon. So we completed both of those analyses that I just showed you, and we created our draft climate adaptation plan update, and this is what that looked like. And that was in, I think I finished that at the October 2017. Then, and that included the adaptation strategies. We have 41 adaptation strategies that largely they specify policy and infrastructure, and the highest rated one, you can see increased public awareness, is education. And so really we can group these strategies into these three buckets. The strategies are prioritized by most important, you know, medium importance, and just important. And after we completed that draft, we also began initiating the update of our local coastal program. Our local coastal program is a policy document that allows the city to issue coastal development permits on behalf of the Coastal Commission. When the Coastal Commission says, yes, you have a certified and approved local coastal program, or LCP, that means that they know that the city will be issuing permits in congruence with the Coastal Act. And so it gives us a little bit more autonomy and flexibility. Right now, the state is requiring that you update those LCPs with sea level rise policies. So we're in the process of doing that right now, and that's been underway for a couple of years. It's a challenging thing, and I'll talk more about that later. So we completed the draft in October 2017, and then we went on the road with it, kind of like what I'm talking to you about here. We did a 9-month 50 event outreach campaign that we completed in June of last year. And what was really unique about it, we really just, took a scattershot approach. We were at the Guelaguetza Festival down at San Lorenzo Park. We were doing community meetings. We were doing small focus groups. We were doing talks with groups like yours. We were doing tabling at Spanish language story time. Everywhere we could get out there, we would be out there. And one unique thing that you can see is that over 20% of our events were held either in socially vulnerable populations where they live, work, and recreate, or at an event that was geared towards one of our socially vulnerable populations in Santa Cruz. So that's this 20% right here, and you can see the other folks that we also talked to during this outreach campaign. And by the way, our outreach campaign won the Northern California American Planning Association Merit Award for Social Justice, which I'm really proud of. So then after the outreach campaign, we packaged up what everybody had to say into our final adaptation plan update that got adopted in October of this past year. It got adopted along with the local hazard mitigation plan. Remember, I told you that's another more broader hazard document that was approved by FEMA and California Office of Emergency Services. So we're in really good shape. Doing so also helped us to satisfy SB 379, which requires incorporation of adaptation and vulnerability assessments into the LHMP. The other half of SB 379 is to incorporate all of this stuff into the public safety element of the general plan. And the general plan is the overarching development guidance document, policy document for the city. It basically sets forth all the city's policies related to development. And so that is in progress this year. Our planning department is doing that. Another super important facet to my work, our work, is collaboration across scales. Climate adaptation is a really new field of practice, and it is challenging to jump into, and fortunately, we have all these different collaborations going on. I'm actually the chair of the Central Coast Climate Collaborative. I'm the local government chair of the Monterey Bay Regional Climate Action Compact, where we do tons of knowledge sharing, webinars, sitting down doing working meetings and so forth. I also sit on the County Commission on the Environment and work really closely with their planner that's working on these same issues. And we're really they're ahead on some stuff, we're ahead on other stuff, and it's really, really good to be coordinating across that scale. We also have done some exchange visits with Marin County. Marin County is arguably the leading local jurisdiction in climate adaptation, particularly with respect to sea level rise in California. We had them come down, their planners come down in December of last year. We did a 3-hour working session where we compared where we were with meeting regulations, policy development, and so forth. And then we went out in the field and took a look at, we went to Capitola Beach, we went down to Main Beach, we had the county and Capitola there also, and we're getting ready to go next Friday up to Marin and do the same thing up there. And I'm hoping to pick up from them. Marin has an award-winning board game called Game of Floods, play on Game of Thrones, and they just published a board game version. You could previously just kind of print it off your computer, and so we're going to pick one of those up next week because we actually, I'm going to share more about this later, we're in the process of developing a card game, a Santa Cruz specific card game. The gamification space is really something that I'm starting to work a lot in virtual reality. I'm going to share more with you about that later, but Marin's doing all of it. And then lastly, the state organization is the California Alliance of Regional Climate Collaboratives, and I'm on their executive committee as well. So that's how I'm getting the policy information and the toolkits and the resources on how to do this stuff, and say, hey, does anybody know how so-and-so did this? And that's how we kind of figure things out. So it's been really, really helpful. And I should mention that these groups are not just local governments. They include nonprofits, consultants, other folks that are just interested in advancing the practice of adaptation. So what's ahead? we have a lot of things in the works. One thing that I've been working on with the county, and some other agencies like NOAA and USGS is getting a tidal gauge in Santa Cruz. Right now, our closest tidal gauge is in Moss Landing. There's also one in San Francisco. And we are unable to measure sea level rise specific in Santa Cruz. So a tidal gauge will be very helpful in that way, particularly as we develop what's called monitoring trigger and threshold programs. If sea level rise gets to X, then we do this. We implement this policy. We move the road back. We move development back. Without having a tidal gauge, we can't really say when we would hit that metric. So that's something that we're working on right now. I already mentioned the San Lorenzo River flood mapping, so that would be climate influenced flooding. So right now we have hydrology, which looks at, you know, how does precipitation run off through the watershed to the river, and is the levee able to contain that volume of water? But what we haven't looked at is what does climate influenced precipitation look like? Again, increased intensity, potentially increased frequency, and will our levees hold that? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the other part of my time I spend is also on flood control work, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the regulatory authority for our levees, and they have prescribed the hydrology protocols that we do, but they haven't included climate influence. And that's likely because they're a federal agency, and that has not evolved at the federal level. But we're doing that work out of our own due diligence, and to better understand our risks. I am working on, this is super exciting, I have a virtual reality sea level rise application that is getting ready to be released in an Oculus headset environment. It's super cool. Again, I worked on this with Giuliano Khalil, and his company, Virtual Planet Technologies, wanted to use Santa Cruz as a proof of concept for next generation virtual reality depicting sea level rise. There have been some past efforts in that space, which were really good, but we're kind of pushing beyond and have something more sophisticated. The city is not going to release that virtual reality application until we've been able to integrate it into the two projects I'm going to talk about very shortly here. Oh, in fact, it's the next one. West Cliff Drive Adaptation and Management Plan. I'm going to show you a little more specifically on West Cliff after this slide. So I'll skip that one. Same thing with the secondary implications of sea level rise policies and strategies on beach use, beach access, and coastal resources. So we got a grant from Caltrans for the West Cliff Drive plan, and I got a grant from the Coastal Commission to develop these policies and strategies that protect beach use, beach access, and coastal resources. And again, I'm going to tell you a little more about that in a moment. We also need to complete our local coastal program amendment, including those sea level rise policies, and that will come after we conclude those two projects I just mentioned, as well as the safety element of our general plan, and then that satisfies fully our SB 379 requirement. We've also begun reporting annually to City Council on our adaptation efforts. Previously, we only reported on our emissions reduction efforts, and so that's terrific. Another thing that we've begun to do, which we did not do in the past, is that the city has, I think it's about $100 million capital improvement program projects, 100 million in capital improvement program projects. Those are your street intersections, your sewer pipes, your, all kinds of different infrastructure related projects. What we've done in the past is we've looked at those sets of projects every year when we do our budgeting, and we determine those that actually implement our climate action plan. This time around, we also have specified which implement our climate adaptation plan. We create lists of each, and those go on the front page of our capital improvements program budget, so that when City Council is making their decisions about what gets funded and what doesn't, they have the information to inform them. If they are so inclined to prioritize this kind of work, you know, they have that information to do so. So I'm really excited about that as well. You know, we're continuously looking at how can we improve our policy and process to really improve the use of the climate lens. Let's talk about Westcliff. So on Westcliff Drive, of course, you know, we're facing increased erosion, potentially loss of beaches. Again, that phenomena that I discussed, you know, when you have seawalls and you have sea level rise, eventually you're gonna lose your beach, and we have pocket beaches at Mitchell's Cove, it's other areas that we need to be concerned about, and we have coastal access points there. We also potentially are facing transportation impacts. I mean, I'm sure everyone's been out on Westcliff and seen this, right? Not so fun to see that your lovely bimodal path is falling into the ocean. So what is driving this Westcliff Drive project? In the past, the city has, when things like this have happened, we have gotten emergency permits. There's been articles in the paper, this is one of them right here. We have gotten emergency permits from the Coastal Commission, but not closed them out with the Coastal Commission, so they really technically, you know, need to be closed out. So the Coastal Commission has wanted us to develop this plan for almost 20 years to address not only those emergency permits, but how are you, City of Santa Cruz, over the long term, gonna deal with the effects of sea level rise on Westcliff when you have all of this benefit, public benefit going on Westcliff? So the project that we're doing is really gonna set forth a community vision for what we want to see with Westcliff over time. Out through 2100 is the time horizon for this project. So again, just looking at our mapping, just to zoom in a little bit more, you can see here that, you know, we're projecting, you know, by 2100, we're gonna be well into the roadway of Westcliff. You know, what do we need to do to protect it? Or are there areas that maybe don't need to be protected? Could we, for example, over at Lighthouse Field, reroute the road to behind Lighthouse Field if that indeed is an area that we decide we don't wanna protect with more armoring? This is a interesting kind of contrast as well. I told you that the black and white is the coastal armoring, the riprap and the seawalls. What you're looking at here is what we're expecting in terms of erosion at year 2060 with the armoring is the red part. And then what if the armoring fails? Because it's gonna fail, right? These things only have a 50-year lifespan. And the perspective of the Coastal Commission is that they would like to see natural erosion. They would like to see places get away from seawalls to maintain beach access, to maintain intertidal habitat and that kind of thing. But they also do recognize that that does not work in every area. How does Santa Cruz allow migration of the coastline back when we have homes that only can be accessed from Westcliff, right? So again, the no armoring, the yellow, shows you kind of how far back we're kind of projecting that erosion right now. So again, I think this really demonstrates why we need to do this project. In our adaptation plan, there are a few strategies called out. Prioritize coastal protection structures for upgrade, so again, the seawalls and so forth, and beach management policies and plans. We're getting ready to start a project to do that. Investigate the coastal armoring, beach nourishment, so adding more sand to the beaches. Green infrastructure, is there a possibility for, say, living seawalls, or down on the beach, vegetated dunes? The state has a huge focus on green infrastructure, again, because it has multiple benefits. It creates habitat, it buffers storm surge, and so forth. Protect our visitor serving venues, recreation and natural resources. Of course, that's a high priority, and protect the natural shoreline. Some things that have been completed already, we call out increasing biodiversity. We have worked with Groundswell Coastal Ecology, a local nonprofit, to do coastal restoration at both Seabright Beach and at Natural Bridges, and a few spots along Westcliff, and we will continue to do so. Expanding access, affordable transportation, recreational opportunities, we continue to do that. Our bike share launch is one of the biggest examples, I think, of how we've increased affordable transportation. And then we've also done initial outreach to the community, kind of discussing these various adaptation options or solutions. And so some of this is already underway. But the project itself, specifically, what is it gonna do? Funded by Caltrans, $342,000. Our consultant will be selected by 1 week from today. We're in the process of evaluating proposals right now. It is gonna fund showing not only the hazards in our virtual reality application, but showing different solution options so that we can understand what do people prefer. Because there's trade-offs with all of them. More seawalls, less beach. Managed retreat, maybe not having access. So that we will be describing those trade-offs in the application as well. We're forming a technical advisory committee that's pretty large at this point. It's about 20 people. We're gonna be conducting a base conditional inventory and assessment. That's not just our coastal armoring, but that includes habitat, transportation infrastructure, utilities, amenities like artwork and benches and restrooms and so forth. We will be doing an alternative analysis of adaptation strategies that will include a full cost benefit analysis, including non-market valuations, things like what is the value of ecosystem services? What is the value of recreation? Something that's not super tangible. We'll be doing some coastal use recreation surveys to get at that. And we will be establishing what's called a monitoring triggers and threshold program. I already mentioned that. If erosion gets to this point, then we go to one way. If sea level rise gets to this point, then we armor more. That kind of thing, so that we have a guide. And I'm gonna show you some kind of sample pictures of what other jurisdictions have done to provide some graphic visualizations of what that monitoring triggers and thresholds can look like. We will actually get conceptual design alternatives, so plan and profile drawings of the preferred solutions. And all the way through this, there is a heavy outreach component through this West Cliff Drive project. Not only are we doing the standard community meetings and focus groups, but we'll be using this virtual reality application. We're gonna be doing pub nights with the Game of Floods game and our card game. We'll be doing the user surveys that I mentioned and a number of other outreach techniques in order to get community feedback, because we do not want this to be something where the city and the consultant says, here, residents, this is what we're offering to you. We want our residents to be part of establishing this vision, and being with us the whole way on this project. One thing that I'm trying to find funding for right now is to do some digital storytelling of this whole project from start to finish. We think that that can be a really good and accessible way to communicate the challenges that we have. And then lastly, this project must result in an adopted plan document by the and that be approved by the Coastal Commission. Let me show you a couple things then. So this is what Imperial Beach's triggers threshold program looks like. So there's these different ways that you can approach adaptation. You can protect and accommodate and retreat, or just retreat. Really it's protect, accommodate, and retreat. Accommodate would be something like elevating buildings. Protect would be seawalls. Retreat is getting off the coast. So what they show us here, the triggers along the top, are depth of sea level rise, right? 0 feet on up to 6.6 feet. They do show the corresponding expected year that would happen. And they say, okay, the trigger point is the red. Okay, when you get to existing armoring is gonna work just fine until 1.6 feet, then you're gonna have to replace the seawall and start to think about sediment management. So it gives us a way to adjust, even if the time horizons aren't right. We know that when we hit this depth of sea level rise, we need to do something, or else we're gonna have a problem. So this is what Imperial Beach did. This is what, I'm sorry, this isn't like the very best graphic, I know it's kind of, a little fuzzy, but this is Imperial Beach's armoring strategy evolution over time. So what you can see over here is in the existing, what we have is you have a nice beach, you've got the intertidal and the subtidal zones, and then you've got revetment or armoring. You keep going through time and you see you start losing the beach, you start losing the beach, you've lost the beach, but you've protected this building, right? Let's look, I do have another one. This is second project. This is funded by the Coastal Commission. This is a $200,000 project. Our consultant, Central Coast Wetlands Group, who did our sea level rise vulnerability assessment, so they have a really good familiarity with what's going on with respect to this in Santa Cruz. Again, the goal is to protect beach use, beach access, and coastal resources. The outreach that we're gonna do, this project is going on the exact same timeline as Westcliff, starting next month, running through the end of 2020. So we're gonna be able to integrate our outreach on both our Bluff-Top Westcliff location and our low-lying beaches locations together. So we're hoping that's really gonna help us to optimize the money that we have. Essentially, it's the same scope of work as Westcliff, the inventory assessment, the adaptation strategy analysis, the cost-benefit analysis, the monitoring triggers and threshold program, and the concept designs. The result of this project needs to result in that local coastal program amendment that has the sea level rise policies. So that has to be the endpoint of this project. And let's look at a couple sample maps. This is an example graphic from Monterey Bay sea level rise study that Central Coast Wetlands Group did. And what you can see here is all these beaches in the Monterey Bay area. They looked at when they would be impacted, so when would they be potentially lost. And you can see the red is year 2030, the orange is 2060, and the yellow is 2100. So, we're showing Main Beach here is close to 2100. I have to say that this is a little bit older of analysis, so our analysis will be, more current and modern. Back here, they've got potentially 2060. There's some areas over here that are 2030, some of those pocket beaches. So we expect we're gonna have some similar visualizations like this, and potentially like this. I mean, again, this is just another example from Imperial Beach, but this is a beach dune, beach nourishment hybrid strategy. So putting in some kind of vegetated dune with more sand replenishment. And again, you see over in the upper left-hand corner, what do we show as existing? You have a lot of nice beach, you have some revetment, maybe then you put in a dune and that dotted sand, you can see is an added sand that buys you some more time. And so that's what this looks like. You see that the water keeps raising, but you have, beach and protection both going on here. So these are what we've asked for in our RFPs, our requests for proposals, is we want good visualizations like this, and there are others that are doing this kind of stuff, so that when we communicate with the public, it makes it really easy for us to explain what can be really difficult and technical concepts to explain. And with that, this is my final slide. I have a call to action to you. I suspect that you all are already doing this because as stewards of our ocean, you're already environmentally conscious, I'm sure, but I encourage you to please keep reducing your emissions. That is the only way we can slow down these impacts that we're facing, which are, we have done also the value of all of the infrastructure, so property and infrastructure that's in those hazard zones. And by 2100, it's approaching $1 billion just for Santa Cruz, right? And that's not even including our non-market valuation like recreation and ecosystem services. So really important to keep reducing emissions. We have a handy dandy fact sheet that has really simple and cheap emissions reduction strategies. You probably already know them. You can consult other resources like Drawdown, which is a really popular framework for emissions reduction. Also, I encourage you to know your risks. Our other side of our action sheet has tips on flood, wildfire, erosion, landslides, and drought preparedness. So I've got 20 of them here. Take one if you'd like. And lastly, please continue to be part of the conversation. It's super important that we all work together on this kind of stuff, and the city is very committed to that. So with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah, go ahead.
Aren't they constantly pumping sand out of the harbor mouth? What are they doing with that sand?
I think it goes on the Twin Lakes beach.
Yeah, they have a bulldozer that pushes it up to keep it.
We do have some other beach nourishment projects that are in the works. Right now, we have a project that's called the Bankful Project that's at a 30% design stage, which will basically in the San Lorenzo River between Water Street and Highway 1, Soquel and Highway 1, we would essentially put a smaller channel, a smaller, deeper channel into the San Lorenzo River. The purpose of doing that is when you put a smaller channel in, you can increase the velocity through that section, which would prevent sedimentation from happening, because as sediment comes down the river and, settles out into the riverbed, we lose the flood control capacity of the river. So we wanna get that sand moving again, but in order to create that channel, we have to take out 50 to 75,000 cubic yards of sediment. What are we gonna do with that sediment? Some of the ideas is our beach nourishment at Main Beach, right at the river mouth, where that river mouth sometimes starts to meander over, and that's a serious safety issue. We also are thinking about utilizing it for a vegetated dune at the river mouth. That's another project that we're scoping out right now as a feasibility study on what are the solutions for Main Beach and the river mouth. The beach nourishment is part of it, and so that's part of the conversation. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me here. I appreciate it.